Where are you tuning in from, Lydia?
Arizona, the desert outside Tucson.
Very cool. You said sunlight and I was like, whoa, what's that like?
Yeah, but the sun's set, so my face is it's gonna get darker and darker, but that's okay. I'm just in front of a window and I don't have great light in my room, but I don't think anyone cares.
I think it'll look great. All right, we're gonna wait a little bit longer. Let me see how many we're waiting for. Well, that is my mistake. I never started it. My bad. I'm sorry, folks. I started the recording and forgot to let people in. Ooh, there they are.
Whoops.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a little bit longer to let folks trickle in and then we'll get started. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Shani, and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight's event with Jessie Greengrass presenting her new book, The High House. She'll be speaking with Lydia Millet, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Jessie, Lydia, and the team at Scribner for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts there. And if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered, please post that question in the Q&A module, which is the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll only be pulling questions from there tonight. Tonight's featured book, The High House, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore, open 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup or shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat every so often. As a thanks for attending tonight's event, we're offering 10% off the featured book, Greenlight Events 10, in the coupon discount section at checkout, and I'll be posting that as well. Our interviewer tonight is Lydia Millet. Lydia has written more than a dozen books of literary fiction, most recently the novel A Children's Bible. She works as the chief editor at the Center for Biological Diversity, an organization dedicated to fighting climate change and the species extinction. Lydia will be speaking with our featured author, Jessie Greengrass. Jessie spent her childhood in London and Devon. She studied philosophy in Cambridge and now lives in Berwick-upon-Tweed, Northumberland, with her partner and children. Her collection of short stories, An Account of the Decline of the Great Auk, according to the one who saw it, won the Edge Hill Prize and Somerset Maugham Award. Her critically award acclaimed debut novel, Sight, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Jessie's new book, The High House, explores the lives of four people making a home cloistered for the time being from the encroaching threat of environmental disaster, following Caro, Pauly, Sally, and Grandy as they come of age, reminisce, bicker, mourn, and wonder at the changing world from their tentative refuge on a hill above the sea. Jessie is going to start us off with a reading, and then she'll be talking with Lydia and with all of you. So take it away.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a section from towards the beginning of the book. I don't think there's much that you need to know. It's the character speaking is Caro, and Pauly is her younger half-brother. I left school for good at lunchtime on the day I turned 18. I walked home. The house was empty. I had no plans, either for the afternoon or for the time beyond it, my life which stretched empty ahead, or didn't. It was becoming clear to everyone now that things were getting worse. The winter before, half of Gloucestershire had been flooded, and the waters, refusing to recede, had made a new fen, covering homes and fields, roads, schools, hills rising from it like islands. In York, the river had burst its banks, and the city centre was gone, walls which had stood for nearly 2 millennia washed halfway down to Hull. People didn't say these places were gone. They didn't say there were families living in caravans and service stations all along the M5, lined up in the car parks with volunteers running aid stations out of the garage forecourts. People said they must have known their homes were vulnerable. We were protected by our houses and our educations and our high street shopping centres. We had the habit of luck and power and couldn't understand that they were not our right. We saw that the situation was bad elsewhere, but surely things would work out, because didn't they always for us? We were paralysed, unable to plan either for a future in which all was well or one in which it wasn't. I'm not going back, I said to father when he came home from work because the school had called to tell him I had left. What will you do instead? He asked, and I shrugged one shoulder up and slid my eyes away. There had been daffodils in the park at Christmas. The coast path had been redrawn at 6 different places over the last 3 years. I have to go and pick Pauly up from nursery, I said, unless you're going to do it. And I walked down the road to where Pauly was waiting, standing at the gate in his coat and hat and mittens. Your shoes are on the wrong feet, I said. No, they aren't. Oh, well, if you say so. What did you have for lunch? I can't remember. Strawberry sponge for pudding. Tasty. I love you, Pauly. I love you too. Can I watch a film when we get home? No. Pasta pesto for tea. He took my hand, and worry burned off like mist. That evening, Francesca came home. I don't know where she had been, but she smelled of mould and filthy water, and she was exhausted. She looked thin. After Pauly was in bed, I sat with her and father at the kitchen table. What will you do? Father asked me, and Francesca said, that's a pretty stupid question under the circumstances. Father let his breath hiss out between his teeth. He said, we can't just give up on everything. Of course not, Francesca said. And then, turning to me, anyway, we need you to look after Paul. So then I knew how absolutely she had given up. Later, unable to sleep, I went downstairs to fetch a book, and standing in the hall, I heard them talking, father and Francesca together. The door was slightly open, and I watched them through the crack it made. They were still sitting at the kitchen table just as I had left them, side by side, facing my empty chair. Father asked, are you so sure? Yes, Francesca replied, I think I am. We always knew a tipping point would come. It's a surprise, really, that it's taken so long. You could stop, father said. If there's no point, we could stay together for a while at least. Caro is unhappy. Paul too, probably, although I agree it's harder to tell. They were silent for a long time then, and I stood very still in the corridor and thought of Pauly, the way his body twitched in his sleep, the tense look he got when Francesca was there, and how it was not hard at all for me to tell if he was unhappy or not. At last, Francesca said, I might be wrong. There was more silence, and I waited. Father said, we could be a family. When Francesca spoke again, her voice was sharp and pointed as an awl. At least this way, she said, they'll both be safe. The next morning, when I went downstairs, father was in the kitchen drinking coffee, and Francesca was gone. She had an early flight, he told me. She said to say goodbye. To me, I asked, or to Pauly? Both, of course, both. Pauly, bounding down the stairs, ran straight towards me, calling, Caro, Caro, I dreamed I was a robot. The day began.
Sorry, it just took me a minute to unmute myself and come out of my reverie. Thank you for reading. I'm really happy to be here with Jessie, because I think she's a great writer and quite an important writer. And this is a really sad book. It takes courage to write sad books, so I think I want to talk about that a little bit later. But first I thought, what I'm always curious about, and what it's just a basic thing that writers kind of, I don't know, I find quite rarely get asked in these events, is just sort of for a little biography, just like a little story of your own life and how you came to be a fiction writer. I know that you studied philosophy, but that's not really a life. It's a bit of a life. So yeah, maybe you could just talk about yourself a bit, and we will move on to more abstract matters, but I would just like people to hear a bit about you and how you ended up where you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of oddly kind of accidental, I think. And I know that kind of traditionally you're meant to sort of dream of being a writer from a very young age, but I was always a reader. So I was a sort of classically odd child with not very many friends, and I read a lot of books. But the idea of actually kind of writing one seemed very, very far away. And so, yeah, then I studied philosophy and I loved it. And I think that I think that a lot of my work is kind of ideas based, like the ideas come first. And I think that I sort of got that from philosophy, and also just kind of the like the discipline of essay writing, I think is really useful. I think, you know, the sense that actually you have to, if it doesn't fit in the essay, it has to go. It doesn't matter if it's a good point. It doesn't matter if it's interesting. If it doesn't have a place, then it doesn't belong there. And then while I was in my final year, my mum got very ill and I had to graduate. That's fine. I did graduate, but after that I came home to look after my mum, and so I was a carer for sort of a year until she died, and then after that I sort of lost my. I mean, I was then quite ill, and I sort of lost my way. And I think that writing, I started it initially because I had to fill my time with something, and also because it helped, I think. And I didn't at the time have any intention of of taking it further, but I guess it's sort of I found that I really did enjoy it, and it really was very helpful, and possibly I was quite good at it. So it sort of came accidentally out of a set of circumstances, kind of, you know, and I find that interesting. I think lots of people have in their lives, you know, moments of kind of real derailment where you think, actually, if that single thing hadn't happened, a whole other life would have kind of come about. And I find that idea very interesting.
Can I ask what sort of philosophy you studied? Was it continental? Was it phenomenology? What was it?
No, it was. Yeah, they don't even believe that's philosophy in Cambridge. There's none of that.
Sorry.
None of that weird stuff. No, it was kind of straight down the line, kind of analytic philosophy. So I ended up, you know, we sort of started with Hume and Descartes, and went on from there and did a lot of logic. But I ended up being really interested in kind of ontology, and also the philosophy of language, and kind of Wittgenstein, like his sort of later work, which I just find, like, really weirdly for a work of philosophy, just very, very moving. You know, it's really, there's such a lot in there. There's such a lot of kind of emotion from a sort of lonely man in this kind of extraordinary, in you know, his second book. It's really beautiful.
Do you often sort of go to those sorts of abstractions when you're writing fiction? Do you sort of, because you said you write from ideas, right? And which I also do, but from a less erudite perspective. And are you sort of consciously thinking, you know, in those kinds of analytical terms when you're writing fiction, or is it just sort of you know, I don't know, sort of like a texture or an affect, or, you know, something less direct, something with a less linear relationship to what you're doing in fiction?
I think it's got less linear as I've gone on. I think I started with a much kind of clearer sense of, like, this is the kind of idea or the territory that I want to explore, and then I have to fit a narrative to it. But I think probably I'd describe it maybe as a habit, like it's just a kind of habit of thought, that those are the terms that I kind of think of the world in. So I think you know, I write a lot about the spaces between people, and the kind of fate, like the way that kind of language can bridge a gap, but also it is a kind of constant process of sort of misunderstanding, like the fact that, and sort of subjectivity, the fact that it's a blessing that people can't hear your thoughts, but it's also a kind of locking in. And I find that those kind of dualities very interesting, and yeah, I think they do sort of filter through, or they're possibly less than they did.
Yeah, I used to think a lot, well, I still do, about just sort of the, you know, the sort of sacredness of the privacy of the mind as a I don't know, a place of being, a refuge for being, you know, but then also our sort of longing for community. Then the constant tension between those things, and I see that. I mean, I see that a bit in this book, and the sort of the solitude of everyone. And, you know, so coming to like end times narratives, of which this is is one, or apocalyptic narratives, or dystopian, or I don't know, whatever sort of categories you want to invoke. I mean, there's this whole world of preppers out there, like the doomsday, the prepper folks. And a friend of mine writing her book was a book about, also a novel about climate change, was very preoccupied with the world of preppers. And even though I've worked on the matter of climate change for 20 years or more, and extinction also, I've never really been captivated by that culture of sort of doomsday folks, because what has always struck me about that sort of prepper culture, besides the fact that it involves political gestures that are I'm not particularly interested in, or aren't familiar to me or whatever, but is the idea that that if you survive a terrible event, a catastrophe, a sort of global end time of some sort, the idea that you alone surviving would be sort of a pleasant objective is kind of problematic, and I see that in a lot of that sort of ideology of preppers and stuff, the idea that we can just be islands and we'll be okay, that this projection almost of the notion that really we are a society, we are these groups that we've built, and without them our aloneness would be so terrible that we wouldn't really have a self in the way that we have come to understand it. And this book to me sort of touched that. I mean, I guess maybe you could speak to how you came to write this particular story, which I actually find quite realistic, actually. I don't actually find it to be, even in a way, highly speculative. It seems to me like a fairly realistic projection going along certain possible lines in I don't know, in scientific reasoning and and history and stuff. So sorry, I'm kind of blathering, but I guess just to talk about how this became the book that you wanted to write, and sort of how you sat down to write about climate and about this great weight,
So I suppose that there were sort of a couple of ideas coming into it, and it began actually not as a novel about climate change. It began that the very first idea was to do with the fact that, I don't know how much this is sort of the case in the US, but certainly in the UK, in rural communities, very much kind of a lifestyle has been lost in the course of kind of 2 generations. And it's not just that it's been lost, it's like it's been completely forgotten, particularly in coastal communities. The kind of fishing industry that people that sustained those communities for centuries is gone, and it's not just gone, it's obliterated, like the memories of it are gone, and many of those places now exist as kind of Airbnbs. Basically, they're just they're unsustainable, and it's very fraught for the people that do live in them, because increasingly all of the property is turning into kind of empty holiday houses. So I wanted to write about that because it really interested me, this sort of idea that you can lose something and you can become so sort of divorced from it so quickly. And then as I thought about that, it seemed more and more relevant to climate change, because I think that what we've forgotten is that what we've got is not ours. It's not our right to live like this. My parents didn't have washing machines that, even in the course of sort of 40 years, I think that things have changed so much in terms of what we think we need to live. So that aspect kind of turned it, I think, into a kind of climate novel, and then it sort of grew sort of organically. I also read a lot about crofting, which I think goes back to your point about prepping, because crofting is sort of, I think, held up often as this kind of paradigm of self-sufficiency, but actually if you look into the details of crofting lifestyles, it was absolutely kind of community driven, and it was driven by trade, and you couldn't croft in absolute isolation. People needed you know, a network, even if it was a very kind of dispersed network. And that comes across sort of so clearly in kind of narratives that people's accounts of crofting lifestyles. So all of those things sort of fed into it. And then I think the last thing was that, you know, I grew up reading sort of nuclear apocalypse novels, and I was sort of interested in the ways that what we're facing now is different. And I think, you know, with a sort of nuclear threat, it's like there's a button and it's pressed, and afterwards you're either dead or you're a survivor, and someone can just not press the button. Whereas what we're facing now is like there's no button, it's just, you know, it's sort of a kind of a network of causation, you know, tiny events impacting on one another, and the idea that there's a point at which you can say it's happened and now we're the survivors seems impossible to me. It's like, you know, people are dying already, so in a sense we are surviving, like that's what we're doing, and as this crisis goes on, you know, that balance will be tipping. There'll be more people who've lost, you know, more people whose lives have become untenable, or more refugees, more people who've actually lost their lives, and I wondered what survival would look like under those circumstances, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, do you think, and I get asked this question, so I have to visit the terribleness of this question upon you also, which is what you think the role of fiction writers is with regard to climate change. Is it different from the role of visual artists or musicians? Is it different from the role of journalists or science writers, or just folks who aren't doing any of those things? You know, what sort of, how do you see that? And you know, you can answer it however you want. But it's I find it to be a really tough question, and also a really annoying question, but probably one that is worth asking, at least of writers who are, and I think particularly of writers who aren't writing about these things personally, but certainly also those of us who are.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a question that I have also been asked before, and it's a tricky one. I guess I find it much easier to answer if it's phrased more generally like that. I think, like, sometimes people say, well, what do you think your role is? And you know, my answer to that is, you know, it's minute. Like, I don't pretend that my particular role is important in any way. And I think that, you know, the point at which you start seeing your own book as the survival of the species is the point at which you need to go outside. I mean, I think that it is different to, I think that the role of kind of fiction writers and possibly artists and is different to that of kind of science writers. I think they're complementary. You know, I think that it is important to have sort of fact-based, I guess, I mean, just information, just correct information feels or kind of evidence-based information feels so important at the moment. But I also think that making it, I think that what fiction can do is open up a space for discussion. I think it allows people to imaginatively understand what we're going through. I think it allows, to an extent, it allows people to kind of explore their own worries and anxieties. And you know, it is a sort of collective endeavor. And I think if you write a book and you hope that people will read it, then to some extent you're kind of entering into a dialogue and you're opening that up. And I think that is really important, because I think if we all spend our time kind of sitting in our own living rooms worrying, then it's just overwhelming. And I don't think that change will come if we keep doing that. So I think that possibly my best guess at what kind of our job is to participate in the conversation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. So this book, it struck me, I was just sort of like rereading bits of it before this Zoom, and I was reminded how, you know, how kind of devastating it is. Well, I'm not going to offer us spoilers, but it's very sad. It's a very sad book, and it was never not going to be a sad book, and it should be a sad book, and all of that is true. But I guess it's interesting to me to think about how you felt while you were writing it, and to, I don't know, I guess what role sadness plays in your writing, sadness and, we make these, or try to make books that are lyrical and that have beauty to them, and sadness is often a great part of that. But, different kinds of writers have different ideas about thinking of readers and markets and stuff like that. I'm personally not a writer who ever thinks of those things while I'm writing, so I'm not really capable of it, right? But some people do, and there's sometimes a fear of writing the kind of like elegiac sadness that is in this book, which I think is pulled off admirably. But yeah, I guess just maybe to talk a bit about sadness in books and sadness in life, and and how those two fit together for you.
I mean, I think that, I also don't find myself really capable of thinking commercially at all. It feels like if I did that, I wouldn't be able to work. Like,
right.
But I mean, so there's sort of a joke. My partner quite often jokes that, if I just write a shopping list and it's sad, like it's just, it doesn't, I don't do it on purpose necessarily. I think it's just that those are the stories that kind of attract me, or that I'm drawn to, and somehow I think, oh, this time I'm going to do a funny one, but somehow even in that I seem to be able to hone in on the small part of it that is sort of somehow kind of sad. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe that is sort of in me somewhere, and it's kind of coming, it's coming out. I think I'm probably, I mean, I'm not a devastatingly sad person, but I think I have a tendency to kind of melancholy, and to kind of seeing that in the world. And, I also feel like the world at the moment is a really melancholy place, it's sad. And I don't know what a better response to that would be, than trying to kind of depict it, I suppose. So I think, I guess my answer is, I do think that sadness is important, but I also find it unavoidable.
Yeah. And so I know that, in your personal life, you have children, and this is a book with children in it, and parents and step parents, and also siblings who are like parents. And I have, because I work in conservation and environmental field, where a lot of folks do come out of a kind of, not so child having mindset. I myself also have 2 children, by the way, but I've often, faced questions of bringing children into this world. Why do you make that decision? How do you feel about your children sort of growing up and in a situation that really sometimes seems fairly intractable to some of us, and to others, still full of hope. But I guess, like, do you sort of your thoughts about having children, being a parent, how does that affect the way this book was written, and were you particularly, I guess, inspired in some of its, in some of the geometries of the characters of the book by your own children, and feelings you may have about what the future holds for them?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I don't have any, I mean, I had children, and I think that, I think that much is made about the idea that women who don't have children are selfish, but I think that there is nothing more selfish than having children, like you do it.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, you just make a person because you want to, that is just an insanely selfish thing to do. And I didn't, I don't think that at the point that we were making the decision to have children, we thought very much beyond the fact that we desperately wanted children, and how are we going to manage to keep working, basically. I mean, that was our, that was our main thing. But then I think afterwards, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I do very much worry about it. I worry about them. I worry about the fact that my oldest daughter is 7, and even in those kind of 7 years, it feels like things have progressed so far. And I think that the question of what being a good parent looks like under those circumstances, and if you kind of project forward, to the point at which this novel is set, which I suppose is any time between sort of 20 and another number of years. What do good parenting decisions look like? Is it more important to look after your children in the moment that you're in, or to look after their future? And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that those are all very good questions. I'm an only child, so I think that I wrote this, I started writing this when my youngest daughter was sort of 6 months old. And I think that I was very interested in sort of sibling relationships and what those look like, and trying to kind of imagine. And I can remember sort of as an only child, and quite a sort of miserable only child, sort of growing up and being fascinated by other people's sort of family dynamics. And I think a lot of that has kind of has gone into the book, and I think that the characters grew very much out of the dynamic that I wanted to create. Like, I didn't start off with the characters and wonder how they would relate to one another. I was like, I want people that relate in these ways, and then I have to make the people.
Are any versions of your actual children sort of ghost images in the book, in the characters that are in there? Because I was doing this myself with my son a bit in my last book. I realized, sort of doing this kind of, perhaps, or even with my daughter, these kind of semi-idealized wishful versions of them. Of course, yours are quite young, so that might not be similar.
No, I definitely think that they do, and I sort of, I find that I've written their mannerisms in, or kind of their preoccupations, or suddenly, there's bits about, Pauly when he's a very young baby and he's sort of building towers and pointing at birds, and a lot of that was kind of from the fact that as I was writing it, my younger daughter was kind of beginning to do those things, and I'd sort of find myself writing them into it. And yeah, I mean, I guess I think I'm less. It's less idealized versions of them than idealized versions of me. Like writing better parenting, more patience into this book than I necessarily show them.
Yeah, it can be wishful from both sides for sure. The way we write, characters and families and stuff, I guess. There's a question here, which maybe I could read out for you. And also, other folks, if anyone has questions, you can put them either in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A little section there. It's actually fine either way. But this is a question from Deborah Nystrom or Nystrom. She says, what is the relation in the book between sorrow and the lively, vivid sense of the characters and their world? So more toward what we were bringing up with sadness.
So between sorrow,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there's a constant tension in it between their sort of global sadness and their grief and loss, and the fact that their daily life is difficult but has moments of joy in it, and they find kind of joy and comfort in one another. But that's all. I feel like that's always been my experience of grief, or of kind of times of great sadness, is that the fact that there's that kind of deep bedrock of kind of upset or loss doesn't detract from the fact that on a surface level you can be happy, like you can be finding moments of joy, you can kind of comfort, you can offer comfort and be comforted. And so I think that what I was trying to find was this interplay between their sense of all that they've lost, which I think is different for each of them. And I wanted that to be, like Pauly's loss is very different to the older characters, because he can't remember this world before. So he's got this sense of kind of blankness. But at the same time, you know, they live in a sort of slightly wonderful kind of place. You know, the work is very hard. And again, like going back to the idea of crofting, I read a book which I would thoroughly recommend, called Nightfalls in Ardnamurchan, which is about the end of crofting on the Scottish peninsula of Ardnamurchan. And the author is, his father was one of the last crofters, and he also has crofted at periods in his life. And he writes very vividly about the fact that the life was extremely hard didn't mean that they couldn't also find it beautiful. You know, they were living in this extraordinarily beautiful place, and they were attempting to kind of keep on living there. And the difficulties of it didn't diminish the beauty of it. They kind of coexisted. So I think that sense of kind of the coexistence of different states of mind, or different states of emotional existence, was something that I was trying to get to.
Yeah, because this really is a book about a utopia within a dystopia, right? It's a sort of it's a little oasis. It's a little almost island on a larger sort of landscape of desolation. But there's a lot of beauty to exactly where they are in this sort of in the house and in the grounds of the house and all that. And I guess, you know, this really is also a book. It's really a book about cultural extinction, right? And which is very closely linked to language extinction, as we know, in the world. Languages are going extinct even more quickly than species are right now across the globe. So I wonder if, like, you were thinking about that too, sort of just, it's not only a climate change book, but it's an extinction book. It's a cultural extinction book, and maybe as it relates to crofting, as you said, and also as it relates to sort of like fishing culture and all that other stuff, but could be extended. I mean, so many cultures disappear all the time and at once. And I guess I'm wondering if you also were researching in that direction and stuff while you were writing the book, sort of cultural and language extinction, since you're a language scholar in part.
I mean, I suppose not directly, but I did sort of research sort of much more kind of specific kind of losses, so the history of very specific towns, and there's a place in Suffolk near where my grandparents lived that I went to quite often as a child, called Dunwich, that was a medieval port. I mean, a really important medieval port. You know, huge, many churches, and it's built on a part of the coast that is eroding, and during the course of the last sort of 400 years, it has just fallen into the sea. Initially, there was a very, very big storm that rerouted the mouth of the river, and so overnight, this kind of port town lost its harbour. And you know, and then from then it went on, and it's such a peculiar place to go to. It's like now there's kind of a few houses and like the back wall of a church, which might even now, you know, might be gone by now. And I like the kind of sense of sort of all that's been lost there is so kind of palpable. All of that kind of extraordinary sort of beauty, and craftsmanship, and the ways of life that existed within it and supported it. So I did think about that quite a lot. Also, the book Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban, which is a book that I've sort of read many times over the course of my life. And that's a sort of post-apocalyptic novel, but it's really interesting because it's set sort of millennia in the future, or millennia after the apocalypse. And the thing that has always struck me as being so extraordinarily profound in that novel is that the people in it have this great sense of what they have lost, but they don't know what it is. You know, they don't know the specifics of it. What they know is that they're kind of living in a decayed version of something that was greater. And they go to kind of Canterbury Cathedral and try and sort of make sense of that. And there are, you know, wind turbines and kind of power stations, these kind of decayed structures that they don't know the purpose of. They've got kind of remnants of memory, kind of cultural memory around them. And I thought about that a lot in reference to Pauly, who's, you know, who I felt was sort of the first step on the way to that. You know, he has words that he doesn't know the meaning of. You know, they're like, they have a sound, but they have no kind of substance. So I did think about that kind of quite a lot. I think, yeah.
Yeah. There's another question from the audience here. It is, can you talk about the counterbalance between Francesca and the grandfather?
I mean, I think that they were sort of, I suppose they're two sort of, again, they're two versions of the question of whether it's better to kind of stay or go. You know, do you try and look after the future, or do you kind of stay and look after what's happening in the present? And yeah, I mean, I guess I'd not really thought of them as kind of counterbalances, but I suppose that they are. And they also, in the few scenes where they meet, I think that I would hope that you get a sense that they very much understand one another, even though nobody else quite understands them. Like, they know what is happening. So one of the things about the book that I felt was really important was that it was about people, it was about children, or about kind of adolescents, because it felt very important to me that they should have the consequence but not the culpability. So they have inherited this set of circumstances. I didn't want them to feel, I didn't want the sort of main characters to feel that they were morally compromised. So there's literally nothing that they could have done, because they are children. But they have to somehow kind of deal with the consequences of their kind of adult, of the sort of previous generation's decisions. So I wanted Grandy and Francesca to be versions of those kind of histories. And, you know, Grandy has been sort of living in this kind of increasingly empty coastal village, doing no harm, but also, I mean, arguably not doing anything positive beyond kind of trying to keep this village going, which is not nothing. Whereas Francesca has been, you know, she's an activist, and she travels, and she does nothing but attempt to change the world, but doesn't do anything kind of locally. So, you know, it's sort of, and I don't know which of those is the better kind of paradigm, or if it's possible to find a kind of middle ground. But I think that that's one of the things that's so difficult about the climate crisis is that there's no, you know, going back to the kind of apocalyptic button, you know, that you can't just say, well, don't press the button. You know, there's the question of what you do is so hard to kind of to unpick and unravel and answer.
Right, and the sort of the question of how to be in this time, and how to act, and what can be done, and what the role of hope is, whether hope, you know, to invoke hope is just a cop-out, you know, or whether it's just a psychological necessity. I hear a lot of people talking about hope in a way that's sort of empty when it comes to these things. But at the same time, I know that certain forms of hope, you know, we honestly would just sort of die without, right? And so I don't know, I saw it sort of as Francesca being the soldier who goes off to war almost, and Grandy being that, you know, keeping the home fires burning or something. He seemed to me a deeply moral character,
Yeah.
Obviously, and very gentle, and, you know, a lovely character, really. Whereas Francesca, even though she is doing the right thing, was much more annoying in certain ways, at least right to the to some of the other characters. You know, to not have her attention maybe was needling to them. And I think of that like with children and their parents. Even just like a parent going to a regular job, if they work long hours, can be really annoying to a child, right?
Yeah.
Who wants all the attention and so forth.
And also she doesn't, I mean, she doesn't explain herself to anybody. Like, I think that is, and like, you know, that is a parental decision, which some people make. Do you kind of constantly attempt to sort of interpret yourself for your children? Or do you just say, right, look, this is what's happening. We're going out now. Everyone, put your shoes on.
Right.
And her, you know, her version of caring is to attempt to care for, you know, the planet. But I think that if you're the child that is being cared for in that way, then that must feel kind of very sort of unsatisfactory, I think. But then
it's a recipe for a lonely child for sure.
Yeah. But then, you know, if we did actually think about it kind of logically, then, you know, why the imperative to kind of prioritize our own children over other people's children, I think is a part of what has got us into this mess in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what do you do?
The idea that like the parenting of one's own children is one's sole responsibility to the collective, I think is, you know, is a terrible one. You know, and the sort of like social license to stop there, like, you know, is, yeah, I think it's been very destructive and continues to be, really. It's what you said about the selfishness, you know, like really, you know, don't we have to step outside our own houses finally? You know, don't we have to do that? Isn't that the true responsibility that we have as parents, which are, you know, we're not just parents of these individual beings that we've physically or adopted, but physically, biologically created or adopted, but also we're the parents of the whole world to come, right? That's what parenthood is. It's actually protecting the future of the young, right? And I think we neglect that tragically. So absolutely, I like that Francesca doesn't explain herself, and also that the narrative doesn't waste time explaining really what she's doing when she's away, you know? I mean, and you achieve total suspension of disbelief, I think, despite that. Like, there's no need for you to sort of deconstruct what activities she could be pursuing to try to fight this fight. We believe that she's off doing it, you know? Let's see, there's another question. The concept of hope is turned upside down in this novel. So interesting that Pauly was relieved when he got the news of his parents' likely demise. He no longer needed to hope or anticipate their return. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I think that it's important that to understand that, you know, Pauly's life has been, yeah, he's a very young child at this point, and his life has been kind of tense. Like, you know, Francesca, his mother, disappears for long periods of time. They don't know when she's going to come back. She comes back and kind of frantically tries to compensate by being, you know, being a mother and trying to fill that gap, which she's to some extent kind of resigned to her stepdaughter. And so I think that Pauly's experience is that once he knows that she's not ever coming back, it's almost kind of easier, because then, you know, it's the question of grief again. Like if you're constantly being left by somebody who may or may not come back, you can never let go of them. Whereas if you know that somebody's gone, then you can kind of mourn them and you can move on from that. And I think that's sort of what he experiences, is just this kind of sense of you know, well, that's over. Like that difficulty, that kind of period of uncertainty is ended. And even though that's a great sadness, it's kind of easier to live with. That's a hill that you can climb.
Yeah, the uncertainty is the cruelest thing, yeah, after a while. Yeah.
I mean, I think certainly for children it is, when they have no power to kind of intervene or affect. So, you know, uncertainty for children is like this kind of is an absolute impossibility.
Yeah, like for the stock market.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's see. So we might have time for like one more question if anyone has one. I'm not seeing any more right this minute. Or Jessie, if there's something that you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked you about, we have about, you know, 8 minutes or 7 minutes or something.
I don't know.
Yeah, sorry.
No. I mean, I suppose another idea that I've been thinking about a lot recently in terms of kind of, I guess, and going back to sadness, is the idea of kind of grieving for the world that we've lost. And I think you know, one of the things that's been interesting, so this book was published in the UK last April, so it's been out for a while, and I've done kind of quite a lot of these kind of conversations in this country, and often there'll be a point where someone will say, you know, well, what do you think that we should do? And I don't have a good answer to that. You know, I think that part of the reason that I was writing the book was to kind of explore that idea of not knowing what you should be doing in the face of this. But I think that one of the things that I've sort of thought about progressively is the idea that some kind of collective grief might become kind of more and more important and more necessary, and that if we could do that somehow, or find a way to do it, then what might happen would be something very positive. Like, I think out of grief can come action, and I think that is, you know, that's what the characters in the book to some extent are trying to do, to sort of grieve for what they've lost, except that they can no longer get any of it. You know, it's beyond their capacity to redeem it. You know, and we've talked about the fact that they are living in this kind of peculiar oasis, but it's also a very time limited oasis. You know, they've got a shed they've got a barn full of tins, but once they've gone, they've gone, and you know, there is only so long that you can sustain yourselves by growing potatoes.
Yeah, I actually think that this idea of grief as something really important, even to the political process and to the generation of political will, is sort of more advanced in the UK than it is here. Like, you know, you have Remembrance of Lost Species Day, which I try to do something like for on Zoom or whatever when it comes up. I mean, we just don't, and we have sort of slight buy-in to that here, but really there's not as much cultural discussion, in my opinion, and you know, it's subjective, but of the importance of grieving. It's just not as, because Americans like to, you know, are just such deniers of death and sorrow. It's just a huge, it's a huge part of the culture. And so I think that I absolutely agree and think it's like vitally important that we learn to grieve and don't see grief as defeat or giving up or in itself deathly. You know, it's a crucial part of actually life, right? Celebrating life itself and understanding what there is to save. And so I think that's an excellent point actually about grief.
I think I think grief also allows you to ask and potentially to answer questions around, you know, why is this different to the natural order of loss? You know, like, loss is in fact a part of everything. Right. Where I live, we recently had a very, very big storm, like I mean, not big by the standards of US storms, but very big for here. And it's devastating. There's been about 100,000 trees down in this county. And I was at a friend's farm last weekend, and they've lost a whole wood. So they're pine trees. And the extraordinary thing about it is that the wind was so strong that many of the trees, particularly the pine trees, they've not been uprooted, they've snapped, like they've just snapped in half. So they've got like a bit of trunk just sticking up, and then the rest of it is gone. So they've lost a whole wood, so you can now see right through to the sea. And she said, I was talking to her about it and about kind of grief and climate grief, and she said that they've had quite a lot of men have come, and they've come and they've seen it in the month or so since the storm. And she said that they've cried seeing it, and these are farmers, so they are used to the idea that things die, like that is that's part of their job. But this is different, and even though you can't kind of necessarily pin down what exactly is different or what makes it different, and you can't say that this storm is a result of climate change, you can access, I think, through grieving, that feeling of difference, the feeling that this is not an ordinary loss, I think. And that feels really important. That kind of acknowledgement of what's happening feels like it's vital, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Well said. Okay, everyone. Well, I think that unless, we got one more question. Actually, it looks like a comment. Thank you. Looking forward to finishing your book. Please know that the beach community of Bradley Beach, New Jersey has chosen the High House as our book for our first One Beach, One Read community-wide read.
Oh, thank you.
Next month, and we'll have a community discussion mid-April, and we'll also host a number of related events focused on climate change in parallel with the book discussion. So that's nice.
That is lovely. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Jessie, for being up so late to do this.
No problem.
All right. Thank you both so
very
much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.